Welcome, colleagues, to the Academy of Science of South Africa Book Awards evening. I'd like to acknowledge our very special guests here this evening, including the President of ASSAf, Professor Jonathan Jansen, the Executive Officer of ASSAf, Professor Himla Sudyal, the members of the ASSAf Humanities Standing Committee. I can't see them all, but I recognize Professors John Higgins, Neil Ruiz, and Basa Reddy. And of course, our honored guest, our third ASSAf Humanities Book Award winner, Professor Charles van Onselen. I'd also like to welcome all of you from around the country and from wherever you are. We really appreciate all of you being here. So colleagues, we have a very full program this evening, and we're going to try and keep to the schedule as closely as we can. We're going to start with Professor Neil Ruiz, who was a member of the ASSAf Humanities Standing Committee. Share with us a little bit about the background and the process that we used for coming to a conclusion about the award. I hope that all of us will find this interesting. It's also preparation for Prof van Onselen himself when he comes. But before Prof van Onselen speaks, we're going to have the highlight in some ways of the occasion when Professor Jansen will honor Professor van Onselen. He will make the award. We are then very privileged, after receiving the award, we are very privileged then to have an address by Professor van Onselen himself on the night trains. We understand that colleagues who've heard versions of this presentation before speak about it as having been an enormously stimulating and riveting event each time it has happened. So I thank Professor van Onselen in advance. So before I say something briefly about the awards event itself, let me just do some house rules quickly for all of us. So we have to ask all of us to keep our webcams off, our sound turned off, and to the speakers to say to you, please use your slides and have them ready and open in the background and available when your turn comes to speak. I'm talking particularly, of course, to you, Neil, and to Charles. So the rest of you, colleagues, please know that in now the custom to which all of us have been socialized, to preserve the etiquette for these events, your mics will be muted for the duration of the event, and we're not doing that to shut you up. It's only to manage the interference, please. When we come to the discussion part, colleagues, the discussion part of the proceedings, we're going to please ask you to use the two facilities that are available there for you. The Q&A facility in which you can pose your questions, and the chat facility for you to make any comments. We'd like to please ask you to make this evening as interactive as you can. So the questions, of course, will be processed, and I'm going to have the assistance of Maputi as we go along. But the questions you can put both as we make our way through the program, and particularly when Professor van Onselen is speaking, but your comments also, please, colleagues. I'd like to say just a few words about these awards. So this is the third time we make this award. We began the awards in 2016, so it's still a relatively new intervention in the social sciences and humanities landscape. But we'd like to think that it will become, as with a few other awards that we have begun to be making in the country, standout awards which our colleagues will both look forward to and look up to for building their own careers and in terms of their own ambitions. We began the awards in 2016. In that inaugural year, the award went to Professor Keith Breckenridge for an absolutely remarkable book, which I personally use often. It's a book called The Biometric State. The second book award went to another remarkable South African intellectual whom I also have the privilege to know personally and who has been a great mentor from a distance to me, Professor Chabani Mangani. He wrote that wonderful book. It was called The Making of a Black Psychologist, in which he described the challenging process of developing himself as a psychologist in the time of apartheid. And now this evening, colleagues, we celebrate the work of our foremost historian. And about that, Charles, we want to say to you, there's little debate. Charles van Onselen. Professor Ruiz will speak fully to the significance of his work in a moment, but I just want to say to Charles how honored we are to have him with us this evening. I was very privileged 2 years ago to hand over the Human Sciences Research Council's Humanities and Social Science medal to him, and privileged once again this evening to be a part of this process. We bestow on him the ASSAf Humanities Book Award. What we're doing here tonight is honoring, and this is in our blurb, and I'm quoting now, the writer of a scholarly, well-written work of nonfiction. The book should be noteworthy in its contribution to developing new understanding and insight of a topic in the humanities. This award comes at a critical moment for us in the humanities and the social sciences in the country at the moment. It provides us, we who work in this space, with the opportunity to make clear the value of our scholarship for making sense of the complexities of our country, our pasts and our presents. You will glean from both Neil and then Charles himself that South Africa occupies a special place on the planet. We here at the foot of this continent have within our daily experience the full spectrum of our human complexity, particularly how we as human beings come to define and practice inclusion and exclusion. Right now, those questions of inclusion and exclusion are subjects of intense debate, but we need to understand issues of global significance. And our role in that place of the globe, we must confront, I'd like to say to all of us, we must confront that challenge with both humility and courage, because we have the opportunity here to clarify those politics in ways which very few people elsewhere in the world do. So we do that and honor that task of trying to live up to that challenge on occasions such as these. Through them, we often take an opportunity for imagining our humanity afresh. And so the significance of this event is that it provides us with the opportunity to showcase the best amongst us. And so now I call on Professor Ruiz to speak to you about how we managed the adjudication of this event. Over to you, Neil. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Crane. Good evening, colleagues, and especially good evening to our special guest and our award winner, Professor Charles van Onselen, a scholar whose work has had an enormous impact on my own over many years. I'd like to, as Crane has indicated, I'm going to be tasked to give a few words on the background and the process by which we came to this award. Now, as far back as 2009, the Academy of Science of South Africa undertook a consensus study into the question of scholarly books in the intellectual life of the South African Academy. And that study emphasized the virtue of these works and their contribution to the literature, as well as to the general advancement of scholarship and science. Yet, most professional scholars in South Africa tend to work in intellectual ecologies that essentially favor and promote quick returns and easy wins in the form of journal articles. Now, not for a second do we devalue the intellectual contribution which comes from journal literature and other short forms of publication, but especially in the humanities, we lose a lot if we don't equally or even with greater vigor promote books, as the 2009 consensus report showed. So with this award, we seek to acknowledge the importance of the book as the most significant foundation of knowledge in the humanities. As Crane has indicated, the first ASSAf Humanities Book Award was made in 2016. It's awarded every second year, so this one is effectively the 2020 prize. And we've had 3 major books come out on top. For the current award, we had 31 entries. And these books span the humanities and the social sciences disciplines. And sometimes they went beyond these domains. They were written from within a range of genres. It's important for us to note that they were authored by both senior and junior scholars, and they were published by a variety of presses in South Africa and abroad. Popular or commercial presses, academic presses like Routledge or Macmillan, and also a number of university presses. And this breadth and depth and range and diversity is what I want to highlight. Scholars in the South African Academy have not abandoned the labor or the joy of writing books. What I'd also like to point out, though, is that we also saw some instances where intellectual work of great significance and potential seemed to be rushed to publication with occasionally sloppy editing. And this testifies to, I suppose, to the business models of most publishing houses, but also the pressures which are facing authors. And I suspect that this is a phenomenon that we would find in other national academies too. Let me turn now to the selection and adjudication process so that we can be quite clear that this is as open and transparent as possible. Last year, we solicited entries for this prize via a call that was circulated very, very widely on the ASSAf website, it was sent to universities and all sorts of other places as well. Each entry had to be accompanied by a nomination, which was written by someone other than the author, and several reviews. These reviews were a mix of published reviews and the valuable pre-publication blind reviews that publishers commission before they commit to contracts. The selection panel was made up of members of the Academy's Humanities Standing Committee, and we worked through all of these submissions very, very carefully. Next, we drew up a shortlist of 5 books. And again, this shortlist represented a variety of disciplinaries, of disciplines. And it's interesting and noteworthy too, that not all of those on the shortlist were senior scholars. There were some early career scholars included in that number too. Each member of the selection committee then carefully read all of the books on the shortlist, and after lively and perhaps heated debate, we arrived at a winner, which brings us to tonight. We're pleased to present to you the winner, Professor Charles van Onselen, who will also deliver a lecture on the forgotten histories that inspired his prize-winning book, The Night Trains. Certainly, I believe that Professor van Onselen's oeuvre and this book, more than any other, positions him alongside some of the other greats in the field of social history, like E.P. Thompson and especially Eugene Genovese. With this, I'd like to hand over to Professors Jansen and van Onselen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and good evening to everyone, and especially a great evening to our guest, a special guest this evening, Professor Charles van Onselen. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be able to say a few words and then make the formal award to Professor van Onselen. Charles is a friend. He is a colleague from our time spent jointly when I was Dean of Education at the University of Pretoria. And he's probably the scholar in this country that I admire most, not only for his courage, but for his incredible sense of what it means to be a scholar in a country like this, in a continent like ours. And so I'm very excited to be part of this evening's proceedings. So as the current president of the Academy of Science of South Africa, a very warm welcome to all of you. I want to, before I get into the book itself, just say to Professor Crane Sardin and the team, I pretty much sat on the sidelines of some of these evaluative discussions, and I can tell you the incredible work that these colleagues have done in reading and evaluating and debating with each other the merits or otherwise of each of the books sent for consideration, in consideration for this award. So Crane and the team, thank you so much. I learned so much from you. And I really wish we had recorded those debates. They were amazing accounts of how to assess a scholarly book. Charles might not know this, but he inspired in me the love of the book. I was, as a young academic, I suppose, also into the salami slicing of a small piece of research and putting out articles all over the place. And then I met Charles, and I remember one day I was walking from I think it's the Clerical Library or something like that, on the UP campus, carrying a book, and Charles was sitting outside in one of the campus coffee places. And he saw me, and he shouted across the campus. He said, "Jansen, put away that book. What are you trying to do? You're confusing people." And it was very much a joke we both understood, which was this rarity of a book being seen, being read, being, enjoyed on a campus. And dare I say, as an education person, I very much doubt that our students who graduate after 3 or 4 years with a degree have ever read a book, let alone a humanities book, from cover to cover, because of this idiocy of notes and slides and all kinds of shortcuts into abbreviating, complexity, rather than engaging with the book. And that does huge damage to the intellectual life of the country and of the campus. And so I remember that the joke about carrying a book across the campus, and we sat on it at one of our many coffees together, enjoying the book. But Charles also instilled in me, as a young dean at the time, the value of the book in the development of a scholar. He was the first person. Nobody ever told me that there is a difference between the very first book that you write as a scholar, and that is very different from the second book that you write, which is very different from the third book that you write, and so on and so forth. And I have since then, at every opportunity in which I teach or mentor young scholars, as I did the other day, by the way, in the so-called Future Professors Program, which I lead with Neil, Jackie, and Sibu, I tell them about what the first book looks like, how the second book improves on that, and how the third book sets you up in the international arena as a serious scholar. So the value of the book in the life of an academic researcher. It's something that I have almost single-handedly received from the opportunity, the pleasure, the privilege of working with Charles van Onselen. The last time I think we met physically, this is pre-pandemic, Charles I was supposed to interview him at the Book Lounge in Cape Town on one of his books. And I remember very fondly, Charles, on that occasion, Belinda, your partner, your wife, being with you on that occasion. I remember how warm she was towards me, towards everyone. And I also remember how excited she was about your book launch that evening. And I know that she would have just been so overjoyed, as she always was, an accomplished historian in her own right, but yet so much part and parcel of the celebration and the advancement of your own work. And so I do want to acknowledge the work, the presence of Belinda Bozzoli on this occasion as well this evening. As I said, I know she would have been thrilled, as the rest of the family, no doubt, at this amazing achievement. And so, Charles, thank you for honoring the Academy of Science of South Africa with your book. We feel honored, and we hope that in this evening's proceedings, we too can honor you. So, in case you didn't see some of these comments in the run-up to the opening this evening, let me just cite from the comments, the summary comments that we as reviewers had made in relation to the award-winning book, The Night Trains. I wrote, this book offers something bold, captivating and new, and will unsettle those taken for granted understandings of how this nation was built. John Higgins, Professor Higgins wrote, this in my view is an outstanding work, engaged, humane, and displaying the qualities of sharpness, insight, and balance that exemplifies the work of critical and engaged scholarship at its best. Professor Vasu Reddy wrote, Night Trains is a harrowing and powerful text shaped by pure brilliance. It is written with passion, but also with a deep understanding of the country and the Southern African region's difficult, contentious, and complex past. And then Neil Roos, Professor Roos, offers us a wonderful segue into Charles's presentation this evening. Neil writes, before the book was published, I heard parts of it presented as a talk. At the time, I considered it quite the best bit of history I had ever heard or read. I suspect we are in for a treat this evening when we might very well hear a talk that reflects the qualities that Neil mentions and also the other judges. And so formally, I would like to announce that the 2021 ASSAf Biennial Humanities Book Award is awarded to Professor Charles van Onselen for The Night Trains, moving Mozambican miners to and from South Africa circa 1902 to 1955. You now have sight of the certificate on the screen. Thank you to my colleague from ASSAf putting it up there. And Charles, this will arrive in the mail very soon. With great pleasure and joy, I now call on Professor van Onselen to respond and to deliver his lecture this evening to all of us. Charles?
Right. Right. Good afternoon, colleagues. And let me start by saying thank you to Professor Jansen for your very generous and kind and touching words. When I was a boy, I used to be allergic to flattery. But with the passage of time, I find that my system has grown to tolerate it exceptionally well. I'm now a full-blown addict. If I didn't know that Professor Jansen was a teetotaler, I'd have sworn that even though the hour is early yet, he might well have had a sip or two of jungle juice. His sobriety, alas, only feeds my addiction. I'd also like to thank Crane Sudin and Neil Roos for their kind and generous contribution. Thank you too to the Academy and the judges for the honor that you've done me. I would like to think that this is an honor bestowed also on the University of Pretoria, its Centre for the Advancement of Scholarship, my colleagues in the Department of History, especially Professors Karen Harris and Alois Malambo, and for historians both in this country and abroad. A book like The Night Trains cannot be erected without the historiographical scaffolding provided by scores of excellent studies. So I wish to thank all those who've preceded me in the study of migrant labor in Southern Africa and not only in South African studies. There are many ways of trying to identify, understand, and reward scholarly merit. Prizes are, by their nature, often contentious, and the results eminently worthy of debate. Questions arising include not only those about the book itself, but also about the composition and the nature of the panel of judges who sometimes lose sight of excellence and reality. It's therefore necessary for those in the academies, the learned societies, and the professional bodies to sit back and take a critical look at all the certificates, medals, and prizes they've offered over the years and assess to what extent their judgments have been vindicated. Likewise, books that have been awarded prizes should be subject to constant critical evaluation and re-evaluation. One of the essential components in any such exercise is something that appeals to historians, and that is the lapse of time. I would suggest that as part of good intellectual housekeeping, a good intellectual housekeeping exercise, academies, learned societies, and professional bodies everywhere should, say every 10 years or so, sit back and look critically at all the awards they've made over the past decade and assess to what extent they've identified authentically long-lasting works of excellence and to what extent they were captured by academic fashion, considerations of gender, the identity politics of the day, or the political tides that occasionally surge through societies. If they've avoided all of those traps, they should step forward and take a bow. If not, they should reflect critically on where, when, why, and how they may have allowed their eyes to stray from unalloyed considerations of merit. Nobody should want a national prize that is restricted to bald old white men, to vegetarian butchers, or to left-handed disc jockeys. On second thoughts, I'd like to take one of those examples off the table. In the South African entertainment industry, for example, we've long passed those points. The print media, radio and television are now well beyond parody. In much the same way, I think we should allow the test of time to pass judgment on the merit of books awarded prizes. The longer the bookshelf life of a work in the humanities and social sciences, the more likely it is to be of merit. A book that continues to contribute to and actively inform debates and intellectual works for 10 or 20 years after its publication is likely to be of a high standard. The same test will, alas, apply to the night trains. If it's still being sold and read in 10 years' time, well, that'll be meaningful. So let this be a warning to both me as an author and to the Academy that while we might celebrate the night trains this afternoon, the real test is still coming down the line. Old Father Time is looking at both of us critically, and we need to be mindful of that. In truth, history is the real judge of the merit of authors of books and of learned societies. Now, all that said, let's turn to the business at hand. I'm going to proceed on the assumption that at least some of you will have read the book, and I'll therefore only be highlighting a few themes that the book covers. But let's start with two tangential questions. Why write this book, and why write it now? The Night Trains is an essay that got too big for its boots. It was never meant to be a book. It was to be but one essay in a set of 8, exploring the historical relationship between Anglophone, Calvinist, industrial, and urban South Africa, and neighboring Lusophone, Catholic, commercial, and rural Mozambique. It focuses on mine workers, but there are many aspects to that troubled relationship between the countries that are nearly as important and which will be explored later in a 2-volume work. The Night Trains is also part of a lifetime's focus that emphasizes the importance of regionality, how integrated the Southern African experiences were. In this case, the deeper underlying nature of the exchanges that were between two very different types of colonies. The even wider unstated context of the book is an interest in comparative labor repressive regimes in a region dominated by imperialism and colonialism. In South Africa, we had slavery, most developed in the Western Cape, indentured labor on the plantation crops on the East Coast, sugarcane in Natal, and various forms of paternalistic racial and economic oppression of Black Africans on the Highveld. All of them brought about degraded, if not dehumanizing, forms of labor exploitation. In terms of indentured labor, however, Mozambicans got the worst form of it all through mass mobilization being allocated to a regional urban industry notorious for its occupational diseases and low wages. Now, by looking anew at such transnational indentured labor, the Night Trains makes for a flanking, indirect questioning of South African exceptionalism. Exceptionalism is the grandmother of nationalism, and historically has been much loved by Afrikaner and African nationalists. The DNA of exceptionalism has the potential to open up pathways to exclusion, racism, segregation, xenophobia, and in extreme cases, genocide. Long before apartheid was formally introduced to the country, white South Africans were arguing how they were confronted with a set of uniquely difficult circumstances in terms of imposing their imprimatur on the politics, economics, and social structures of an industrializing country. In the fullness of time, this chauvinist and uninformed take on history fed into the widely held belief by Black South Africans that what they had been made to suffer was on a scale unparalleled in human history, and that as such, they constituted a special case requiring case-specific recognition and therefore particular concessions and compensations for past injustices. Now, these two complementary views are most certainly not analogues, and they're not equivalents. They're not mirror images. They cannot be plotted on the same graph of history, even if there are elements of truth in both. But place them both in their broader regional setting, and they'll use some of their purchase on both historical understandings and reality. The Night Trains is a reminder to all South Africans that there were hundreds of thousands of Mozambicans who were exploited more harshly than almost any other grouping in the region for a longer period and at lower wages in a key formative industry. Both white and black South Africans benefited directly and indirectly, albeit unequally, from that merciless exploitation of our neighbors. We need to be far more honest and nuanced in the telling of quote unquote our history. Our history is also their history. Mozambicans constituted the vast majority of our mine workers for more than half a century. Now, in thinking or writing about the night trains, I was attempting, from very limited archival resources, to reconstruct the train journey of migrant Mozambican workers and, at the same time, issue a wake-up call to the historians of Southern Africa not to be imprisoned by the artificial national boundaries when trying to uncover the lost kingdoms of the mind. I was trying to show that there's more to history writing than heroes and hagiographies and political parties and praise singers, and that there are few propriety rights when it comes to suffering in colonial Africa. I wanted to remind the Chamber of Mines and some snobbish English speakers in this country that they were part of a monstrous system and that they were as complicit as were many Afrikaners in fashioning a modern world of horrors, not only at home, but throughout the region. The night trains, let me have a drink. The night trains is also an attempt to prod historians to take another look at transport technology and reappraise how it enabled, informed, and shaped patterns of racial separation in industrializing South Africa, as well as apartheid. Technology is seldom, if ever, class neutral. It plays a central role in using speed in different ways to help conquer differences in time and space by bringing together and enhancing the factors of production. Think cell phone or internet if you want to. In the 19th century imperial and colonial settings, it helped both to conquer and to maintain distance, essential components of a functioning, oscillating, migratory labor system based on race and underwritten by weak peasant economies or patterns of subsistence production. Within this context, we probably need to take another look at the role of transport in our own history and understand more clearly its dehumanizing propensities and reappraise the experience of migrant workers in particular. The steam locomotive was central to the migrant labor system. In the absence of first-hand oral or written testimony, as seen from the workers' perspective, the night trains is merely an experiment aimed at reclaiming part of those forgotten histories. It's not as if we lack clues. Huma Sekela's magnificent Stimela and Shorsoloza, poignant reminders of the pain of foreign migrant workers, have, ironically, been enthusiastically adopted by South African nationalists and even rugby spectators. By adopting these songs uncritically, the region is narrowed down to the country is narrowed down to our nation, and the nation spoken for by cultural nationalists who one suspects are perhaps not all that well informed when it comes to the deeper matters of economic or social history. Nationalist ideology can telescope and reduce the complex and supple into brutal banalities. How many South Africans would know that the trains they sing about so lustily also had specially designed barred compartments incarcerating those broken returning migrants who'd been driven insane by the mine compound experience and who'd been stupefied with alcohol or drugged by sedatives and put in straitjackets for their final journey back home to Mozambique. Maybe if we look at transport and history anew, we South Africans might gain a new insight or two into why it is that so many contemporary Black South Africans have such an intense contempt and disregard, if not hatred, for buses, railway stations, taxis, and trains. For many of the poor, the young, and the unemployed, men and women who by gender, race, and space are excluded from the social contract, who are often without easy access to cities, modes of transport are often seen as part of a broader exploitative system in which distance and disaster are twins. For the marginalized, affluent cities are too far away to be able to reach out to meaningfully and too painfully close to be shunned. Urban transport is what links the dreams of the hopeful to the nightmares of their quotidian reality. Bus drivers, train and taxi drivers, proximate humans in a despised spatial dispensation marked by alienation, are roundly disliked, unloved, unwanted figures. It's going to be a long time before I read an African novel or see a film or a play that portrays South African taxi drivers as appreciated or at least tolerated, let alone loved, members of the community in a way that, say, London cabbies are. And until such time, I'll continue to see urban transport as social litmus pointing to a disintegrating society unable to overcome the evil of contrived past separations facilitated by technology. If contemporary transport offers us glimpses of contempt and social distancing, then the colonial dispensation, as recounted in the night trains, presents an extreme example of the propensities of mass transport systems to induce the alienation, commodification, and dehumanization of industrial labor. Railways, state-owned entities manned by uniformed personnel and operated in quasi-military fashion, often accurately reflect the ruling class's hidden cultural assumptions about age, class, gender, or race. These are universal factors. These assumptions, in turn, can be traced through the managerial ideologies and the terminology used to describe passengers in the official reports, timetables, and written instructions of the railway authorities. In the case of Mozambicans, that language could not have been more explicit. Mozambican migrants were termed anything but passengers. They were, quote unquote, natives in batches, third-class fares, or, quote, special Bantu fares. It's not by chance that the impairment of human dignity through crass racism on the railways did so much to raise the political consciousness of both Mahatma Gandhi and Pixley Semle, both who went on to challenge white supremacy. These racialized ways of thinking on the railways also shaped the operating realities of the system and sometimes contributed directly to train accidents. Train drivers were divided into first and second class drivers, with white passengers benefiting from first class drivers, while second class drivers operated so-called mixed trains, quote unquote. That is, trains which carried both African passengers and commodities such as coal or other goods. The major accident at Waterval-Boven in 1949, in which 62 Mozambicans lost their lives and many others were badly injured, was driven at the last minute by an inexperienced second-class driver. On the railways, it took decades for African miners and migrants to be classified as humans in passenger trains rather than as commodities on so-called mixed trains. But one supposes these dangers are now all receding. South Africa is very rapidly becoming a post-rail society, not through modernization and the introduction of viable alternate systems of transport, but through arson, corruption, cynicism, decay, mismanagement, neglect, theft, and sharing competence. Soon there will be no functioning rail system at all left for our urban communities and workers. Once upon a time, the rich and the railways helped to consume the people and their labor. Now the crooked and the poor are consuming the railway system itself. In many countries, it's the government that issues health warnings about hazardous substances and other things. But in countries that hope for a successful future, it should be the electorate that issues warnings about the dangers posed by incompetent and corrupt governments. But I digress. Reduced to bare historical facts and read only for what appears on the pages, The Night Trains is in essence a plain, albeit exceedingly painful tale. The basic architecture of the book is simple, if not simple-minded. It explores the difference between the migrants' experiences on the incoming and outgoing rail journeys of the Mozambican workers. When charted carefully, these differences lay bare the anatomy of the migrants' misery through simply recounting the central components and timetabling of their journey. The book starts by exploring, excuse me, the origins of the Eastern Main Line running from Johannesburg and Pretoria through to Lorenzo Marx, what is now Maputo. More importantly, it points how a history of slavery in Mozambique helped soften up southern Mozambique for the coming of expansive predatory forms of industrial capitalism in search of cheap black labor. The Witwatersrand Native Labour Association, WNELA's recruitment system, relied on Portuguese complicity and co-option and the use of labor that for many years, perhaps as many as 20, had to be forced into accepting indentures that relied on criminal, not civil penalties for enforcement. As with the train itself, the language and terminology employed by white laborers, recruiters historically was often redolent with the overtones and words of slave capturing and dispatching. There's an overlap in this country between the historic use of slavery and other forms of labor repression. What is perhaps worth noting is how, for decades, historians of this region were content to debate the extent and ways in which the mining industry was reliant on forced labor and to what extent it was coerced and to what extent it was a response to market forces. Just one glance at the trains themselves would have provided part of the answer. The Night Trains does not answer that question fully, but what it does do is to point how train compartments and windows were sealed, including by metal bars, and how coach doors were locked for the up journey to prevent workers from deserting either at their point of embarkation or disembarkation on the Witwatersrand. So much then for those economic historians who are beholden to the play of quote unquote market forces. The very design of the train spoke of coercion and contempt until such time as the system came to rely more on the push of poverty and voluntary enlistment than forced recruitment. Moreover, the workers were transported by night, not only because the rail system was less utilized for traffic at that time, but because it discombobulated the migrants, reducing the risk of physical resistance, and because it helped conceal the system from any critical or guilt-ridden white eyes. The up trains to the mines was meant to be ultra efficient, as incoming workers had to be timelessly replaced by those leaving, and that is over 400,000 each year, sometimes 500,000. But since the incoming workers were relatively healthy and penniless, few along the lines of the railway stations took much interest in them. They had nothing to take from them other than their health, and the mines and the mine compounds were about to do that. In the mine compounds themselves, the system, without the full or explicit approval of the mine owners, operated with the use and the abuse of mind-numbing substances. In the 1890s, the drug of choice was alcohol. In the first decade of the 20th century, Chinese indentured laborers were dependent on opium, and therefore, and thereafter, for some decades, mine-issued beer rations or worker-produced cannabis helped workers get through a working day or night. The compounds, all male institutions, shared many of the features of prisons, including those that reflected sexual practices that were not necessarily born out of free choice. All of this was in marked contrast to the down journey of the Mozambican workers, who by then were often broken in health and in spirit, but not necessarily penniless. Indeed, it was precisely because the down train constituted a sort of bank on wheels that it was subject to contrived delays, unnecessary stops at stations, and subject to systematic predations by white and black South Africans alike, all keen to fleece the migrants in any possible way. From the moment that they left the compounds, migrant workers were confronted by hawkers of food or trinkets at contrived and often excessive prices, and frequently left shortchanged in the darkness. Within the trains themselves, unpoliced, because this was part of a private train running on public tracks, a wonderful private-public partnership, you know, that thing that we're looking for. The cash or the goods belonging to migrant gangs were often stolen, either by their co-workers or by the train staff. Perhaps most telling of all, however, about the system were the number of deaths that took place on the train. Many workers traveled home in so-called, quote-unquote, hospital coaches, emblazoned with Red Cross signals, but without any doctors or medical staff to attend to people who were quite often terminally ill or injured. As with the recruits, who were never termed passengers or workers, the ill were never referred to as patients, but as quote-unquote rejects, or at very best, quote-unquote sick boys. Sick boys. Now, while no records of the number of deaths on the trains themselves remain, they likely have to run into several hundreds during the last decade of the 19th century and the first 50 years of the 20th. On the mines themselves, about 50,000 workers died between 1895 and 1914 alone. On the trains, corpses were often stripped of their money belts and the bodies then handed to the police at stations through which the train passed. In small rail towns, the corpses were then passed on to the district surgeon to determine the cause of death. And in an unknown number of cases, the lungs of the victim were removed and sent to Johannesburg for medical research. The bodies, many of them with either just a metal tag and a number to identify them, or completely nameless, were then interned in graves in racially segregated cemeteries in small towns up and down the line of rail. The dead got as little respect as did the living. This then was the migrant labor system as served by the state railway system and operated by the Chamber of Mines. This was not a genocide in the conventional sense that we understand that term. Not a single Mozambican miner was ever deliberately consigned to a death camp or executed or consciously infected with a fatal disease. And yet, when one stands back and looks how the system as a whole and the trains operated and the trains within it operated, one is sometimes reminded of the near parallels that happened to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire on the eve of the First World War, during the First World War, or the Jews in Nazi Germany. Railway systems are politics writ large. The night trains then is an experiment in the reclamation of forgotten histories. It's an attempt to use a manageable entity, unit, a railway system, to illustrate the functioning of a political and economic system that we're now in danger of either forgetting or of trivializing. The book tries to speak to all South Africans, rich and poor, black or white, and because we want, as with the wording on the war memorials, to remember, quote unquote, lest we forget. It's also a tribute to those Mozambican workers who helped make modern South Africa what it is today. The economic plight of southern Mozambique in particular is in part testimony to the destructive powers of Southern African industrialization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. That was, I'd like to say, very moving. You did several things in this presentation. You were talking to the features of the system that we have inherited, but you were also talking to us as people of compassion, looking on and how we come to understand what had transpired in that time. So I'm going to invite our colleagues, 95 of us, to make comment, but let me help with kicking it off. So, you know, the way in which we've characterized our history over the last 500 years is to put particular phases of this history into periods, and we give those periods names. So for us in making sense of what's happened in the last while, we take that period, for example, from the period of Francis Galton, and that was the substance of a lot of Keith Breckenridge's work, who won the first award, from about the 1850s till about the 1920s, as the period of scientific racism in South Africa. But this period of the 1920s reaching into the 1950s is an incredible moment in the making of this society that we have. And you're foregrounding for us here the place of technology, and you're coming to pay particular attention to railway transport, and looking at the way in which human subjects were treated during that particular period, that process. So what I'm asking you, are you drawing our attention to beginning to think differently of that period of the from the 1920s onwards? I mean, are you alerting us here to the necessity for us to in our scholarship be moving to another way in which we could come to be understanding the nature of capitalism and the forms of capitalism that were in operation at that time? Is my question reasonably clear, Charles?
Craig, I think I understand what you're saying. And let me try and answer it this way. I think that our historiography, in terms of understanding the nature of the capitalist revolution that overtook South Africa in the 20th century, has been outlined in broad form, and we have quite a good understanding of that. And because we're South African, we have prioritized, quite rightly and correctly, race and how race and racial considerations have been factored into the structure of industrialization and how exploitation worked. But it's as if we have been content with a caricature and we haven't looked at all the cascade of factors within that and how they're assembled and how they reinforce racist exploitation. I think we've not taken technology and tried to understand its everyday impact. The train is a very crude and crass example because that's the sort of thinking that I'm involved with. But if you took something like, say, the radio, and the impact that radio had and what its content was and in which constituencies it was delivered, with which stories, at which time, and to what extent they reinforced the systemic functioning of a racist capitalist society, I think we would come to a far more nuanced understanding of what goes up to make South Africa as a whole. You know, we're still extremely primitive when it comes to our own social history. And what one's pointing to here is a series of indirect, tangential links that need to be explored and understood in their own right to see to what extent they both reinforce or help or limit the system as it functions. I don't know, is that more or less what the lines you were thinking on, Crane, and does that help?
Yes. So I suppose I'm guilty of asking you to put a name on it. You know, as we did with that earlier period of scientific racism. But what you're talking about here is this incredible moment, but it's also a global moment because it happens all over the world. And in some ways, these institutions of which we are a part, the universities, most of all, but also the science councils, you know, the character of Van der Bijl and his pushing of technology at this particular time is something that from about the 1920s, which Smuts takes up, you know, is a really interesting part of how we speak about the growth of knowledge in South Africa, but we've not coupled that in the way in which I hear you trying to do with the ways in which the system comes to inform its politics, its modes of oppression and exploitation. So I'm really asking, are we in this historiographic now mapping of what our country's history is all about? Are we? Would it be helpful to pause now around all of this, as you're saying? Well, you know, and to think about it more deeply. I'm looking for a name, but I agree with, you know, with what you're saying, and I will step back from you know, being so crass and accept that we're talking about a really complicated moment, a long moment in our history.
Right, Crane. You know, let me not belabor this, but I'm interested in what we might call secondary socialization of systemic functioning.
Okay.
If you took the experience of people on the train, at one level it's just a train journey, but in terms of dehumanizing, minimizing dignity, attacking self-esteem, reproducing the psychology of subservience, we have yet to understand fully these mechanisms, and technology and studying technology and how it's imbricated in the system as a whole helps you understand what is it that produces low self-esteem, what is it that produces a sense of defeat, what is it that produces a sense of inferiority, or on its flip side, as we can now see with the attacks on contemporary infrastructure, what is it that produces alienation, hatred, a lack of communal understanding about the strengths or weaknesses of transport systems. These are the secondary socializations that emerge from systemic functioning.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right, colleagues. It's over to you. So we have another question here, Charles, and it says, it goes as follows. If one had not had the railways technology in brackets, would the history of the migrant labor system been different? Stalin also had the railways to Siberia, and maybe the technology of ships enabled slavery.
Well, you know, counterfactuals are always interesting. I would say the history of it's the train especially that helps feed the migrant labor system and maintain a low wage regime and link peasant subsistence with the demands of industrial capitalism. And had that technology not bridged that gap in spatial terms and as well as in economic terms, the push to acquire a resident African labor force and produce African mine villages, albeit if they'd been segregated, would have been much higher. If you look at the late 19th century and right up to the time of union, you'll find that there are a very large number of so-called quote-unquote native locations which grew up on mining property or adjacent to mining property, where you were starting to get an African mine labor craft-like set of skills being reproduced at the site, at the point of production. What the train enables you to do is to pull that away and to distance it and marginalize it, and therefore maintain a low wage regime. So yes, I think had there not been the train, we would have seen a much greater residential African component to the labor force earlier on. What the consequences of that would have been in a system dominated by notions of white superiority and labor reservation, and what the nature and pattern of industrial relations and conflict might have been, would then probably take a different trajectory. But this is the stuff for novelists, not for me.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're talking about novelists. So tell us a little about novelists and imagination and writing into this space.
Right. Well, you know, I think all good history that we aspire to write tells a story. It's about a narrative. And the really successful and great works of history all have powerful narratives. And we're in the business of communicating as historians, and we have our own jargon and our own templates and our own ways of operating. But the specialists at communicating and evoking a sense of time and place are the novelists. And it's the novelists and the playwrights who give us empathy and who sensitize us, who use words in a way that conjure up elements of the past. Historians are partly con artists. We're in part we're in the business of illusion, of creating illusion, trying to make you feel what it was like to be back there and experience a set of events. And for me, novelists have always been central to my own historical imagination and to the way of writing. The very first book I wrote was on African mine labor, and it's called Chibaro, and it was about the hardship of African mine workers in Central Africa. And that work was deeply and powerfully informed by Zola's Germinal. In many instances, my own understanding of how to ask a historical question and how to answer a historical question have come from novels. And that's, you know, that's extremely thin line. It's a very dangerous line to walk, because if you start bending evidence to the point where it becomes novelistic, you're in deep trouble. But equally well, if you write one damn thing after another in boring chronological, sequential fashion, you're no longer in the business of communicating. You must write for yourself then. But if you wish to help influence and shape the way people perceive the past and understand it, to try and draw out humane and humanizing lessons from the past in order to prevent them being repeated, then I would suggest to you that you have to hone your communication techniques as best possible. And the novelists and English literature or any other, whatever other vernacular you want, there lie great lessons for historians and indeed for many social scientists. You know, you can either speak sense or you can speak sociology. You have to choose.
No, thanks very much. Right, anybody else, colleagues? Peter Vale. Right, so Peter Vale asks, in the light of trains, how should we now study South Africa, Southern Africa and its history?
Sorry, in the light of?
Your book, Trains. How should
Yes.
we now study Southern Africa and its history?
Carefully and with imagination. I mean, I know what Peter's saying, and he's pushing in some of the same directions that you are pushing, Crane. But I think it's presumptuous to suggest how we should now approach South African history. There are a million ways. You know, history has got 360 degrees, and all 360 degrees of approaching the center are valid. The question is not, is there one template? Is there one way? Is there one moment? Is there one school? No. There are hundreds of ways of doing this. All we can appeal for is more fluent, more convincing, more factually ground, more exciting, more readable history. But I would never want to say, I think we should now do X or Y. I don't, because if somebody said that to me, I'd say bugger off. Well, why would I want you to tell me what to do? If I'm inspired by what goes on in other countries, and if you mean, if there was a lesson out of the trains or for some of the other books that I've written, then one of the things I would say is, don't buy this nationalist myth of exceptionalism and of writing history in national boundaries. Go and read comparative things. There's not a problem on this earth that has not been experienced by some other society in some or other form in the past. Go and read in comparative ways and then ask, why does those lessons about Indian history apply here? Or as importantly, why do they not apply? That is the way of us getting out of exceptionalism, out of nationalism, and starting to ask deeply pertinent questions that fall within the human experience.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Anybody else?
Hi, can I ask a question? I don't know how to get to the Q&A box. Charles, the one of the things that haunts me to this day is the brutal killing of a Mozambican man in Alex in 2015, Emmanuel. And what haunts you is the photography, of this group of South African men and the stabbing of this man through the heart. And they look for a doctor who himself happens to be Mozambican, but he had fled because of the atmosphere at the time. And it won't surprise you that I'm curious about pedagogy. That is, in an ideal world, I would want every high school kid to read The Night Trains, just partly for education, but partly also to shift this understanding of your neighbor, of your regional neighbor as some kind of a threat, when in fact your country is built in part on the backs of these Mozambican miners. There's sort of a madness, reasoning around education. that doesn't seem to come to terms with this, because honestly, I don't think we're going to resolve this through the political system. I think you're going to resolve this by re-educating, getting you. How does one get the kind of thinking in the night trains into our schools, into our universities, into our so that instead of this sort of very general, vague, abstract, and sometimes quite vengeful thinking around decolonization, which can mean anything, including the burning down of the Jagger Library, as you might have seen in the social media space, how does one counter that educationally with texts that, in fact, tell the counter story, the other story, and Mozambicans, as you know, among others, have been at the scorching end of the xenophobia in our communities. Any thoughts on that?
Not many, Jonathan, but let me try. Let me say this and this is just purely my personal experience. I'm sure we're now so modern and wonderful and sophisticated that it's different. But in my experience, if you want to kill history or historical understanding and make it influence people in terms of attitudes, values, and beliefs, teach it at school level. This empowers teachers and books in a way which is fundamentally unhealthy. It gets reduced to a set of dates, structures, processes, or simple propositions that deny the complexity of the human experience and the complexities of history. So don't look to history to help you. But let history inform film. Let history inform novels. Let history inform drama. And take things like drama, film, and good literature into the schools, and let them push and sensitize young minds to what it means to have a civilized attitude towards contributions that come from across the spectrum. I don't look to history. I don't have much hope of history achieving that. History taught in a classroom is like a kiss of death. When I never did history, I never studied history at high school. I've never done a formal history degree. I didn't read it at university. And part of this was because of terminal Great Trek illness. And that is being taught about the Great Trek in Standard 1, Standard 2, Standard 3, Standard 4. On the day I die, they're going to have to take a baseball bat to my head and beat out the last of the Great Trek. You see, this is what history at school level can and will do. And of course, if you let nationalists loose, and they love history, you let them loose on history, you're in big trouble.
I'm afraid you're right. Thank you.
Yeah. So Charles, there's a question from Sharon Fong, and she says, are you also maybe suggesting about technology and capitalism and the way it socialized us was true then and to now too? The big push on AI may have parallels with trains.
Sure. I'm way out of my depth on this, on this, and I'd like to be able to help Sharon, but I really can't do this. I say, I don't know if this is helpful, Sharon, but let me try. Is try and look at the hidden components of any technological system and ask to what extent it's coded into culture and politics and power. And if you do that decoding exercise, you'll have a far better understanding of both the reach and potentialities of technology and the way that it's limiting and imprisoning. And in that sense, for example, and I know this is not your point, but just let me make it in passing, it's utterly distressing how monopoly capital has taken control of important sections of the media. It's utterly distressing because it starts providing a template, and within that there are a set of codes about class, about race, about nationality, and within that, which are governed and policed by business, not by the populace as a whole or the citizenry as a whole. And then the economic elements of it are utterly terrifying in terms of taxation regimes, its reach, its potential for surveillance, and its potential to manipulate political debates. All these things we have seen. So do they apply to AI? I just don't know enough. I know some of the questions, but I wouldn't even hazard an answer.
Then we've got Jill Murray there, Charles, making the comment, and she says that Neil Postman gives good insights into technology, which is never, and never is in capitals, which is never neutral.
Well, here we go. I'm on the same page. And technology is not only not neutral, it's never class neutral. It's never, ever, ever class neutral. And for those who are interested in building a more equitable society and economy, and more shared values in a homogeneous society that is relatively confident, the impact and the reach of technology has to be thought through much more carefully than it ever is.
Okay, there's a comment from Dr. Govender, and he says, very interesting and unknown history outside academia or those specifically studying this issue. And he says, thank you to you very much.
Well, thank him very much for being willing to listen. Thank you.
Nolene Murray comes on now and she says, hi Crane, she's really talking to you. I'd be pleased to hear from Charles around what he thinks about the road as the road, a physical road as technology. Sorry, I've lost in particular, the question of the N4, EN4, thanks. I think she's talking about the road of the N4.
I'm sorry, I'm a touch lost. You're gonna have to formulate this for me so that an old fella can understand it.
Say a little more, please, Nolene, in the chat there. Just say a little more, please. Okay, there's Mojalefa Ralaketo says to you, were we correct then to relegate history for emphasis on maths and science?
Well, it's never, of course, an either or. In an ideal world, it's both. You just have to go. Jonathan can help you with this, to the classic roots of education. You know, all one can say is at all levels of education, the more those in the social sciences and the humanities know about science, the better. And the more that scientists know about the humanities and the social sciences, the better. This is part of an ongoing conversation, and what one's got to do is try and break down the artificial divides between these. We have extraordinary things to learn about rigor and discipline and presentation of finding from scientists. Scientists have great things, I would suggest, to learn from the way that human systems and economic systems operate, and to what extent they can inform asking different questions and thinking laterally.
Thank you. Nolene, we're waiting if you want to elaborate. Okay, there it goes. So she says, thanks. What's the potential relationship, if any, in thinking the rail and the road together, linking Maputo and Joburg? Is road more productively thought of as infrastructure as opposed to technology, I suppose?
Yes. Yes, Nolene, you ask an interesting question, and the question is about in whose perception and to what ends. I would tend to go where Crane is, that I see this largely as part of infrastructure. But of course, roads, and especially transnational roads, are policed, and there are different regimes on different sides of the border. There are different economic considerations on either side of the border. There are different taxation regimes, and there are different ways of taxing goods and people that are moving across frontiers. And many of the same structural questions that one asks about trains, one could ask about the road in suitably modified form. What the nature of the experience is, I don't know. If we asked a set of residents in Maputo crammed into a taxi about the nature of their experience with the system and with the driver and with stopping and reaching their destination, and how it differs from the trip up and how the trip down, I think we'd find some similarities. And we'd need to ask and explore why those have been internalized and framed in different ways.
Okay, thank you. So let's just take a couple
more. I
hope
that helps.
Yeah. So I see Donovan's hands raised, but a comeback comment from Dr. Troy Govender is like this. And he says, perhaps there needs to be a more accessible medium, such as a children's cartoon publication or via social media, to transmit this important part of our history to a wider audience, especially young people.
Yes, there can be different modes. For, say, if you wish to convey these to contemporary politics, you could produce a Braille edition and see if they could run their fingers across it and understand anything. They may or may not, or you could give them a hearing aid. At the other end of the thing, for children, yes, you could do that, and I suppose somebody will, in due course, do that. The problem is multi-causality, and the problem is nuance and subtlety. And you can reduce history up to a certain point to where you've got a broad template, but you lose so much explanatory power by changing the focal distance. Some disciplines lend themselves to the youth and easy assimilation. It's not by chance that mathematicians reach their peak in their 20s. It's also not by chance that old codgers like me, who've been around for a very long time and had chance to read, can perhaps aspire to writing better, in inverted commas, history, more informed history, probably a better way of putting it, than could some young historian. How can some postdoctoral student who's only been on the earth for 25 years and has only been reading intensively in the discipline for 5 or 7 years know the same as a 60-year-old historian? It's just not possible. There are differences from here. And so one has to think very carefully about reach, focal distance, maturity of audience, and capacity not to lose truth-telling.
Okay, so Donovan's got a question there about UCT and the fires, saying, what are your thoughts on the fires and the impacts on African Studies collection at UCT? Okay.
Yes, a little caricature just to start with before I try and answer that question. There are some students at the University of Cape Town who live in near perfect harmony with nature. They both like fires. Ashes should draw them closer rather than push them further apart. In a university where students burn paintings, let us be very careful how we mourn the loss of a library. Let us hear from those who've burnt the works of art or put them under censorship in the basements in the University of Cape Town about how they feel about the loss of library. So that's my starting political point. How do I feel about it? I feel it's a complete tragedy. You know, what else would one possibly feel about it? What one would like to see is to see those who, and the problem is we don't know the full extent of the damage yet, but to the extent that there are books that can be replaced, let us hope that all of us in the professions and in the learned societies and elsewhere will make efforts to restock that library as best possible. It's an absolute tragedy. But you know what is much more important thing to think about here too is about arson on university campuses. This burning down of this library has come through, we are told, through a vagrant who started a fire and then nature took its course. But what we really need to be thinking through in this country as intellectuals is the role of fire and what it does to human life in the way that Jonathan was talking about, you know, the man being stabbed. We have a history of the necklace, which we love as a political instrument. We have the love of the fire in terms of putting up barricades. We have the love of the fire when we protest at universities, and we've not been immune to burning things. So there are a set of questions here that go well beyond physical infrastructure and books, but go to mindset and arson and its role in politics and society.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that, Charles. There's a question from Van Onselen. The name is Jessica.
I'm not taking it.
You're not going to take it.
Okay, let's see what mischief brews.
She says, can you? No, it's not mischief. It's not. She knows something that we don't know and is prompting us.
Please.
So she's asking us, can you tell us about the archival research experience in Mozambique? What was the state of the archives and the historical discipline in our neighboring state? It's about your experience.
No, it's an extreme. But
let me just add to that, please, Charles. Just tell us about this Wanela archives, please.
Okay.
Also,
well, there's two distinct things here. Jessica's asking about the Mozambican end, which is one thing, Crane, and it's vitally important. The Mozambican archives are the part that I worked in with the aid of an assistant, is really housed in what is best described as a warehouse, and it's acutely vulnerable. It's an incredibly valuable collection. It's not fully professionally organized. It's extraordinary what the archivists have managed to do with very limited resources, and it's just a priceless resource. And it should be enriching South African historians, at least as much as it's enriching Mozambican historians. The Wanela archives are something different. The Wanela archives, Wanela was an offshoot of the Chamber of Mines, and it ran this part of the system, the moving of the recruitment and allocation of migrant labor and bringing it in and taking it out. Now, that collection was handed at some point over the last few decades to the University of Johannesburg, where the papers now reside. My sense from looking at some of those files is that they were weeded prior to the presentation because there were painful, difficult things there, that some of these items had been removed either by chance or more likely by human intervention in order to skew the historical record. Which of those it is, I do not know. But for example, every time one of these journeys was undertaken, a conductor would write a paragraph or two about the journey and how long it took and any incidents that were noteworthy that occurred during the trip. There is no consolidated list of conductors' reports that have survived in the Winella thing. What there are is extracts from them. And so you have to really go through a mountain of documents in order to find a page or two that is relevant to the questions that you're asking or you're interested in. And one of the ways I think that you could do this, if you were fluent in Portuguese, and which is why Jessica's question is important, is to be able to link what you find in the Winella archives and use it merely as litmus to explore some of the Mozambican sources more carefully. Mine is a very crude book. And in time to come, in 20 or 30 years' time, some smart Mozambican student, of which there are very, very many, who's talented and literate and interested in asking these questions, will approach the trains from the Mozambican sources and use mine as a mere English Anglophone locked interpretation that comes from the South African side. And so, you know, this book is schematic. It's a start. It's a suggestion. It's a toy. It's a play. The real full history of the trains has yet to come, and it has to come from Mozambican historians, not because they're on the other side of the border, but because they have a set of rich and informative sources which they could make much more sense of than I could.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Charles. Just so last question for me. Your postscript was a very moving part of this book. That
of the book.
Closing, yes, yeah. You know, writing about your childhood and being in that store, experiencing almost kind of sense of wonder in your engagement with people who were coming into the store there. It was real wonder. Would you, in closing, just say a little about that and its impact on your life?
Well, I think it stands and explains itself, Crane. What I was also trying to do is I'm trying to say a couple of things. I was trying to say it's one's own experience in life, if viewed critically and same time sympathetically, can help alert one to questions which you can ask in an academic way. I was a boy and I was looking at a store and I was amazed by what I saw in that store and by the people who came in there and the way they engaged and what they tried to purchase and what they thought they were doing and what they were acquiring. And so the postscript to the book is really saying, this is the prior socialization and sensitization that was imparted to me before I was a functioning adult that made me predisposed to ask these sorts of questions. And I think, you know, for young historians who are trying to set out and do, say, a second book, because a lot of this stuff is not really suitable quite often to a PhD or a first book, revisit some of your own past, interrogate your own socialization, interrogate your own experiences, and say, to what extent do these inform academic questions which I'm interested in, and how do they add value to my explanation? In a sense, there are elements of biography in all novels. There are elements of biography in all history. That can either be a strength or it can be a weakness. And what that afterward was trying to do was to say, I'm hoping to harness it as a strength.
Oh, thanks. So there is a last question, and I'm going to put it to you, but after you've answered, I'd like to hand over to Neil to do the closing, but I just want to say a big thank you to you, Charles, for spending this time with us, and to say how much I personally enjoyed it. Just to say this to you, you may not ever remember this, but you and Tim Cousins mentored me in the Johannesburg Public Library in 1976. So I was there with you, the two of you. The two of you were there. And I was doing the history of the ICU at that particular point, and writing my honors. And you folks, this is deep apartheid. You know, we're really generous to you, you and Tim, in helping me. So thank you very much, Charles. I just wanted to say that to you. So this last question is, oh my goodness, there are two questions. The last one that I have here is, as a doctor, having seen young tortured souls leaving this world, I'd like to think this truth, your exposure of these systematized injustices caused to them may help their souls rest more peacefully. Thank you. A privilege to have heard this lecture. And then the other one is, to Charles, have you ever considered to co-author with Indigenous scholars in order to get a deeper understanding of their stories or recollections? It seems that there are suggestions that the Indigenous voices are somehow not heard. So if you'll just take those questions, wrap them up, and then I'm going to hand over to Neil, and I stop here and thank you very much. Thank you all, colleagues. Thank you.
Crane, just before we do that, could I say how touched I am about your recollection in the library, and how it was my brother, Tim, who was so helpful to you. I think you can see now, and everybody else can see, that it was a really good investment on Tim and to a lesser extent my part. So thank you for your words, which are touching. On the other questions, would I consider co-authoring a book with an Indigenous, I assume we're talking about a Mozambican in this instance in general. Well, let me make first of all a comment about just about myself. You know, I find writing for myself extremely difficult. I find writing a very painful, exacting, difficult business, and I can barely manage myself. How I would manage with a co-author, I do not start to understand. Would I be willing to talk to somebody else? Yes, absolutely, and try and be of assistance and frame questions, suggest ways of exploring things, finding resources, but actually co-authoring, no. I can barely live with myself. How would I live with a co-author? No.
Okay, over to you, Neil. Thanks. Thank you very much, Crane. Thank you, Charles. Thanks to all the panelists. Charles, that was a marvelous lecture. I think for me in this lecture, Charles has shown us why he needs to be considered among the finest radical historians in the world today, with the power of both intellect and imagination and the command of the discipline to speak out against racism, against xenophobia, against exploitation of labor in various ways, from forced labor to migrant labor to slave labor, and also to speak about the smugness of nationalism and exceptionalism and the kind of cynical coziness that pertains between capitalism and various states, colonial and contemporary. It was a really powerful and potent lecture. The question which Charles poses and then answers himself, that is there one template to write history? He says, no. really should be a wonderful rallying cry for younger scholars to experiment with the discipline. How can we write it? But in fact, before we write it, how can we imagine it? And Charles hearkens to that. This is not a dull drudgery, this discipline. It's a discipline of the imagination. That is where great histories come from, not from assembling jigsaw puzzles of documents, but from imagining how the world operates, imagining the humanness of people and the sorts of experience which they encounter. His point that we shouldn't push history in schools, but should rather see it included in subjects like film and drama and so on. I think is a great suggestion, but it would certainly be evocative in the burgeoning industry and South African history departments as they gear up to train millions of history teachers. So that was a marvelous lecture. Jonathan said at the beginning that I'd commented that hearing an earlier version of the night trains was probably one of the best bits of history I'd ever encountered in a long and unproductive career. Well, having heard Charles speak about it again, I can safely say that it doesn't lose anything in a second telling and after I've read the book. So thank you very much for that, Charles. A couple of other points which I would like to raise before we close. Given the strong representation of more early career scholars in this year's entries for the ASSAf Book Award, the Humanities Committee of ASSAf have been considering very seriously whether or not to award 2 prizes for the next round of this book award, which is probably one of the more prestigious ones in the country, we hope. And we've been considering the idea of awarding one open award and one for more early career scholars. But again, we will keep you posted on that. Crane is going to be writing a piece on the book awards and the submissions we received, and I imagine the sort of general health and status and vitality of scholarly book writing in this country for the South African Journal of Science. So I do urge you to keep your eye open for this. And finally, I would like to thank all of you for giving up your afternoon, for attending, and for some extremely lively questions and comments and engagements with Charles's book. Charles once told me many years ago at the University of Pretoria, I think it was in that same courtyard where he collared Jonathan, that your peers in your discipline get paid to read the rubbish that you write. But a mark of good work is when people from outside of your discipline read it and engage with it. And that's what we've seen here today. People from across a range of disciplines engaging with Charles and his ideas. So once again, thank you, Charles, and thank you to our guests this afternoon. Good afternoon.
There's a train that comes from Namibia and Malawi. There's a train that comes from Zambia and Zimbabwe. There's a train that comes from Angola and Mozambique, from Lesotho, from Botswana, from Swaziland, from all the hinterlands of Southern and Central Africa. This train carries young and old African men who are conscripted to come and work on contract in the gold and mineral mines of Johannesburg and its surrounding provinces and metropoli. 16 hours or more a day for almost no pay. Deep! Deep, 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 deep down in the belly of the earth when they are digging and drilling for that shiny, mighty, evasive stone. Or when they dish that mishmash mush food into their iron plates with the iron shovel. Or when they sit in their stinky, filthy, funky, flea-ridden barracks and hostels, and they think about the loved ones they may never see again because they might already have been forcibly removed from where they last left them, or perhaps wantonly murdered in the dead of night by roving and marauding gangs of no particular origin. So we are told. They think about their lands and their herds that were taken away from them with the gun and the cannon, with the collaborator and the dog and the tear gas and the poison. And when they hear that choo-choo train smoking and puffing and tooting, steaming and climbing and grumbling and hustling and crying and moaning and wailing and screaming and screeching and they always curse, and they curse the coal train that brought them to Johannesburg, Steamela.
But this is all by my life. Yo. Yeah.
Bye.